This is HOA Karen Patrol. The tow receipt was my first clue and her last mistake. Karen barked that she was the compliance officer and she did not need to be reasonable. You are not allowed to ignore notices. She stood in my driveway with her arms crossed, one hand tapping the portable radio earpiece clipped to her white light jacket, her dark brown ponytail swaying as she leaned forward. Behind her, the tow truck idled at the curb, amber lights flashing across the Prairie Crossing Design Review Association sign at the corner. I glanced at my watch. I had a client deadline in 2 hours, and my disabled sibling needed me home by 8. This was not the time. Sandra Reed, Welcome Committee Chair, had been waiting for this moment. She smiled. This is not parking. It is a violation. I held up the guest pass on the lanyard. I said the pass was displayed on the dashboard. She said it was not displayed correctly, and the tow was authorized. The tow driver, a wiry guy in a reflective vest, climbed down from the cab and hooked a thumb toward my front tire. He asked if I wanted to move the car now or deal with the yard fees later. I asked Sandra what rule I had violated. She said my tire touched the edge of the line, and that was encroachment. I looked down. The tire was maybe an inch over the white stripe painted on the asphalt. I work as a commercial photographer, so I always have a camera and extra batteries in my truck. I pulled my phone out and snapped a photo of the tire and the line. Sandra said, "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." I gave her a small thank you, because she just handed me leverage. Let me back up. I moved to Albuquerque 3 months ago to take care of my younger brother, who has a spinal injury and needs daily help. I found a rental townhouse in Prairie Crossing, a planned community on the west side with strict design covenants and a reputation for aggressive enforcement. The neighborhood treated residents like suspects after dark, security patrols, floodlights on timers, and a welcome committee that functioned more like a surveillance team. Sandra Reed ran the welcome committee. She was also the self-appointed compliance officer, which meant she could issue violations, call tow vendors, and escalate fines without board approval. The HOA refused to accept payments online, then charged late fees for the refusal. It was a racket. I signed the lease anyway because the rent was reasonable and the unit had ground floor access for my brother. I thought I could keep my head down. I was wrong. Sandra handed me a parking violation notice the day I moved in. It was printed on bright yellow paper and folded into a plastic sleeve zip-tied to my door handle. The notice said I had parked in a fire lane during the move, which was not true. I had parked in the guest lot with a temporary permit the leasing office gave me. I called the HOA office. The property manager, a tired-sounding woman named Diane, said Sandra had filed the violation and I would need to dispute it in writing within 5 business days, or the fine would auto-escalate. I asked what the fine was. She said $75 plus a $20 processing fee, plus a $10 late fee if I did not pay within 10 days. I asked how I was supposed to pay. She said check only, mailed to a P.O. box in Rio Rancho. No online portal, no credit cards, no in-person payments. I wrote the dispute letter that night. I included photos showing my truck in the guest lot with the permit visible on the dash. I mailed it certified. 2 weeks later, I got a second notice saying my dispute was denied and the fine had increased to $135 because I had missed the payment deadline. I called Diane again. She said Sandra had reviewed my photos and determined the permit was not properly displayed. I said the permit was clipped to the sun visor, exactly where the leasing office told me to put it. Diane sighed and said she would forward my complaint to the board. Nothing happened. Sandra started showing up at my door unannounced. She would knock hard, 3 times, then stand on the step with her arms crossed and her radio earpiece blinking. She always wore the same white light jacket and carried a clipboard with a laminated checklist. She said she was conducting wellness checks to ensure compliance with community standards. I said I did not need wellness checks. She said all new residents were subject to enhanced monitoring for the first 90 days. I asked where that rule was written. She tapped her clipboard and said it was in the Design Review Standards, Section 12, Subsection 4. I asked for a copy of the standards. She said they were available for review at the HOA office during business hours, which were Tuesday and Thursday from 10 to noon. I work irregular hours because of client shoots, so I could not make it during that window. I asked if she could email me a PDF. She said the documents were not digitized and I would need to make an appointment. I made an appointment. When I showed up, the office was locked and a handwritten sign on the door said the manager was out sick. I took a photo of the sign. Sandra appeared in the parking lot behind me. She asked why I was photographing HOA property. I said I was documenting the closed office. She said that was not permitted without prior written authorization. I said I was standing in a public parking lot. She said the parking lot was private HOA property and I was trespassing. I walked to my truck. She followed me. She said I had been issued multiple violations and my account was now in collections. I said I had not received any notices beyond the first one. She said notices were posted to the resident portal. I said I did not have portal access because the leasing office never gave me login credentials. She said that was my responsibility, not theirs. I asked how I was supposed to access the portal without credentials. She said I should have requested them during move-in orientation. I said there was no orientation. She smiled and said, "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." I started keeping a log. Every interaction with Sandra, every notice, every phone call with Diane. I screenshotted the HOA group chat, which I had been added to by accident. The chat was a mess. Sandra posted updates every few hours, tagging specific homeowners by address and listing alleged violations. One message said Unit 217 has an unauthorized planter on the patio. Another said Unit 104 has a non-compliant mailbox flag. The messages had a tone. Sandra wrote things like this is unacceptable, and we need to enforce standards before the neighborhood declines. A few homeowners pushed back. One guy, a retired teacher named Ed, said the enforcement felt targeted and asked if the board had approved the violation list. Sandra did not respond. Instead, she posted a new message saying residents who questioned compliance actions were undermining community safety. Ed wrote back and said that was not how the governing documents worked. Sandra kicked him from the chat. I screenshotted everything. I also noticed a pattern. Sandra was issuing violations almost exclusively to renters and new owners. Long-term residents seemed to get a pass. Ed lived 3 doors down from a guy who had a rusted boat trailer parked in his driveway for 6 months. But Sandra never mentioned it in the chat. My brother, who has been in a wheelchair since a construction accident 2 years ago, pointed it out one evening. He said the HOA was running a shakedown and I needed proof before they escalated. He was right. The next escalation came fast. I got home from a shoot one Thursday evening and found a bright orange sticker plastered across my driver's side window. The sticker said violation notice in large letters and listed my license plate, the date, and a code that meant nothing to me. The sticker was impossible to peel off cleanly. I had to scrape it with a plastic card, and it left adhesive residue all over the glass. I called Diane. She said Sandra had issued a citation for unauthorized street parking. I said I was parked in my assigned driveway spot. She said the citation indicated I was blocking the sidewalk. I said my truck was fully in the driveway and not touching the sidewalk. She said she would review the complaint and get back to me. She did not get back to me. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail saying I owed $215 in fines and fees. The letter included a grainy photo of my truck taken from across the street. The angle made it look like the rear bumper was hanging over the sidewalk, but it was a perspective trick. I printed the letter and the photo. I also went outside and measured the distance from my bumper to the sidewalk edge. It was 18 inches. I took photos with a tape measure in the frame. I mailed everything to Diane with another certified letter. A week passed. No response. Then Sandra showed up at my door again. She said I had been issued a final notice and my vehicle was now subject to immediate tow if parked in violation. I asked what violation. She said any violation, current or future. I said that was not how enforcement worked. She said it was how enforcement worked in Prairie Crossing, and I should have read the governing documents. I said I had tried to get the governing documents and the office was never open. She said that was not her problem. I needed an ally. Ed, the retired teacher who had been kicked from the group chat, knocked on my door the following Sunday. He said he had been watching Sandra target me and he wanted to help. Ed was in his late 60s, with gray hair and a calm voice. He had lived in Prairie Crossing for 8 years and served on the board until Sandra pushed him out in a surprise vote last year. He said Sandra had been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom since then, and the board was too scared to challenge her because she had dirt on half the members. He said she kept a private spreadsheet of violations and selectively enforced rules to punish people she did not like. He said I needed to force an audit. I asked how. He said I should request all HOA records under New Mexico state law, which required associations to provide governing documents and financial records to any homeowner or renter upon written request. I said I was not a homeowner. He said it did not matter. The law covered residents. He gave me a template letter. I filled it out and mailed it that night. I also asked Ed to be a witness if things escalated. He agreed. 2 days later, Sandra called a tow truck to my driveway. I was inside helping my brother with his evening routine when I heard the diesel engine rumble outside. I looked out the window and saw the tow truck backing toward my sedan. Sandra stood on the curb with her clipboard, waving the driver into position. I ran outside. The driver, the same wiry guy in a reflective vest, was hooking the wheel lift arm under my front tire. I yelled at him to stop. He looked at Sandra. She said the tow was authorized, and I had been issued multiple notices. I said I had disputed every notice, and none of them were valid. She said disputes did not halt enforcement. The driver hesitated. He said he needed to see the authorization paperwork. Sandra pulled a single sheet from her clipboard and handed it to him. He read it, then looked at me. He said the paperwork listed a guest parking violation. I said I was parked in my assigned driveway. He said the paperwork said guest lot, space 14. I said I had never parked in space 14. Sandra said someone had shifted my guest pass on the dashboard, and I was now liable for the tow. I said that made no sense. She said it made perfect sense, and the tow yard added an after-hours gate fee, so I should settle this quickly before the fees compounded. The driver scratched his head. He said he was not comfortable towing without clear proof of the violation. Sandra tapped her radio earpiece and said she would call dispatch. The driver said fine. Call dispatch. Sandra pulled out her phone and dialed. She put the call on speaker. A woman answered and said dispatch. Sandra said she had a compliance tow at Prairie Crossing, and the resident was refusing to cooperate. The dispatcher asked for the authorization code. Sandra read a string of numbers from her clipboard. The dispatcher said she did not see that code in the system. Sandra said it was a new code issued this week. The dispatcher said she would need to verify with the account manager. Sandra said there was no time, and the vehicle needed to be removed immediately. The dispatcher said she could not authorize a tow without verification. Sandra started talking over the operator, her voice rising. The driver looked at me and shrugged. He said he was going to wait for dispatch to sort it out. Sandra jabbed a finger at him and said he was contracted to follow her instructions. He said he was contracted to follow company policy, not her instructions. She said she would report him. He said go ahead. The dispatcher told Sandra to hold. Sandra glared at me. She said I was wasting everyone's time and the fees were going to double. I said the fees were imaginary. She said they were contractual. I asked to see the contract. She said it was confidential. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Sandra noticed. She said I was not allowed to record her. I said I was standing on my own property and I could record whatever I wanted. She said I was harassing her. I said she had called a tow truck to my driveway based on fake paperwork, and I was documenting the interaction for legal purposes. She stepped closer. She said, "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." I smiled. I said that was the second time she had said that, and I was keeping a log of every threat and every false claim. The dispatcher came back on the line. She said the account manager confirmed there was no active tow authorization for my address. Sandra said that was impossible. The dispatcher said the system showed the authorization had been entered and then deleted within the same hour. Sandra went silent. The driver looked at her. He asked if she had deleted the authorization. She said she had corrected an error. He said correcting an error meant the tow was not valid. He unhooked the wheel lift arm and climbed back into the cab. Sandra screamed at him. She said she would have his contract pulled. He said good luck and drove off. Sandra turned to me. She said this was not over. I said I agreed. It was not over. I had requested all HOA records under state law, and I was going to force an audit. She said audits required board approval. I said state law did not require board approval. She said I was wrong. I said I had a lawyer friend who specialized in HOA disputes, and he would be happy to explain it to her. That was a bluff. I did not have a lawyer yet. But Sandra did not know that. I called Ed that night. He said Sandra deleting the tow authorization was a smoking gun, and I needed to get the HOA portal logs before she covered her tracks. I said I still did not have portal access. He said he did. He had kept his login credentials after being kicked off the board. He logged in and pulled the activity feed. The feed showed Sandra had created a guest parking violation for my address at 4:17 p.m., then deleted it at 4:52 p.m., then called the tow company at 5:03 p.m. Ed saved screenshots. He also found something else. The portal showed a private message thread between Sandra and the tow company account manager. The messages revealed Sandra had a referral deal. She got a kickback for every tow she authorized. The messages were explicit. One message from the tow company said your commission for March is $620, pending payment. Another message from Sandra said I can generate more volume if you increase the rate per tow. Ed printed everything. He said this was wire fraud, and I needed to report it to the state attorney general. I said I wanted to handle it internally first. He said that was a mistake. He said Sandra would bury the evidence and retaliate. I said I understood, but I wanted to give the board a chance to fix it before going public. He said fine, but I was running out of time. The board called an emergency meeting 2 weeks later. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I got the notice in the mail on Tuesday. The notice said the meeting was to address resident complaints and vote on updated enforcement policies. I called Diane and asked if my records request would be discussed. She said it would be addressed in executive session. I said executive session was for confidential personnel matters, not public records requests. She said the board had discretion. I said I was bringing a witness. She said guests were not allowed in executive session. I said Ed was a homeowner and he had a right to attend. She hung up. I printed the state statute and highlighted the section that required HOAs to provide records within 10 business days of a written request. I also printed the portal screenshots showing Sandra's referral deal with the tow company. I put everything in a folder. Ed said he would meet me at the clubhouse. He also said Sandra had been messaging homeowners privately, telling them I was a troublemaker and encouraging them to vote for stricter enforcement. He forwarded me the messages. Sandra had written things like this resident has filed frivolous complaints and we need to show unity or the neighborhood will decline into chaos. Another message said the board needs your support to remove disruptive tenants who refuse to follow basic rules. Ed said she was trying to pack the meeting with her allies. I said that was fine. I had a trump card. I arrived at the clubhouse at 6:45. The meeting was scheduled for 7. The parking lot was already full. I recognized a few faces from the neighborhood. Most of them avoided eye contact. Sandra stood near the entrance with her clipboard, checking people in. She wore her white light jacket and had her radio earpiece clipped on. She saw me and smiled. She said I was not on the attendee list. I said I was a resident and I had a right to attend. She said guests required pre-approval. I said I was not a guest. She said renters were considered guests under the governing documents. I said that was not true, and she was making it up. She said I could file a complaint if I disagreed. I walked past her. She followed me inside. The clubhouse was a bland multi-purpose room with folding chairs arranged in rows and a table at the front for the board. About 30 people were already seated. Ed waved at me from the back row. I sat next to him. Sandra walked to the front and whispered something to the board president, a balding man in his 50s named Keith. Keith nodded. He banged a gavel and called the meeting to order. He said the agenda included a vote on updated parking enforcement policies and a discussion of resident conduct. He said public comment would be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. Sandra raised her hand. Keith called on her. She stood and said there had been multiple incidents of residents harassing HOA volunteers and obstructing compliance actions. She said the board needed to adopt a zero-tolerance policy for disruptive behavior. She did not name me, but everyone turned and looked. Keith asked if anyone wanted to respond. I raised my hand. Keith said public comment would come later. I said I had a procedural question. He said I could ask it during public comment. I said the question was about records access and it needed to be addressed before any votes. He said the board would address records requests in executive session. I said executive session was not appropriate for public records. He said the board had consulted with legal counsel, and the decision stood. I asked who the legal counsel was. He said that was confidential. I said I had submitted a records request under New Mexico law, and the board had not responded. Keith said the request was under review. I said the statute required a response within 10 business days, and it had been 3 weeks. Keith banged the gavel. He said I was out of order. Sandra stood again. She said I was proving her point about disruptive behavior. She said the board should vote immediately on the enforcement policy. Keith said he agreed. He called for a motion. One of the board members, a woman with short gray hair, moved to adopt the new policy. Another member seconded. Keith said the vote would proceed. I stood. I said the board could not vote on a policy without providing residents the underlying documents. Keith said I was out of order again. I said I had evidence that Sandra was taking kickbacks from the tow company, and the enforcement policy was designed to generate revenue, not improve safety. The room went silent. Sandra turned red. She said that was a lie. I pulled out the folder. I said I had screenshots from the HOA portal, showing her messages with the tow company. I also had photos proving multiple homeowners were in violation of the same parking rule without enforcement. Keith said I was making serious accusations, and I needed to submit evidence in writing. I said I had submitted evidence in writing, and the board had ignored it. He said the meeting was not the appropriate forum. I said the meeting was exactly the appropriate forum, because the board was about to vote on a policy based on false pretenses. Sandra screamed. She said I was slandering her. I said I was stating facts. She said she would sue me. I said she was welcome to try. Ed stood. He said he had reviewed the governing documents, and the board was required to allow residents to inspect records during meetings. He said I had a right to present evidence during public comment. Keith said Ed was not on the agenda. Ed said he did not need to be on the agenda. He said any homeowner could speak during public comment. Keith looked at Sandra. She shook her head. Keith said the board was going to take a recess. He banged the gavel and walked out. Sandra followed him. The room erupted. People started talking over each other. One woman said she had been fined $150 for a guest parking violation that made no sense. Another man said he had been issued a citation for a planter that was identical to the one on Sandra's patio. Ed said this was the moment. He said we needed to force the board to address the records request before they reconvened. I walked to the front of the room. I put the folder on the table. I said the evidence was available for anyone who wanted to see it. A few people got up and looked. One of them was a delivery driver I had seen stuck at the curb a few weeks ago, watching Sandra yell at another resident. He said he had witnessed Sandra issuing citations while ignoring identical violations on other properties. He said he would testify if needed. I said I appreciated that. If you are enjoying this chaos, smash that like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama. Keith came back 15 minutes later. He looked pale. Sandra was not with him. He sat down and said the board had decided to table the enforcement policy vote pending further review. He said the board would also respond to my records request within 5 business days. I asked what changed his mind. He said the board had reviewed some new information and needed time to conduct an internal audit. I asked if Sandra was still the compliance officer. He said personnel decisions would be addressed separately. I said that was not good enough. I said Sandra had been taking kickbacks from the tow company and targeting residents for financial gain. I said the board needed to remove her immediately and issue refunds to everyone she had fined. Keith said the board could not make personnel decisions without a formal investigation. I said the evidence was already in front of him. He said he understood my frustration, but the board had to follow procedures. Ed stood. He said the board had ignored procedures for months, while Sandra ran the HOA like a scam operation. He said if the board did not act tonight, he would file a complaint with the state attorney general and copy the local news. Keith looked at the other board members. They looked at each other. The woman with gray hair said she moved to suspend Sandra pending an investigation. The other member seconded. Keith called for a vote. It was unanimous. Sandra was suspended. Keith said the board would also freeze all enforcement actions pending a policy rewrite. He said residents who had been fined under Sandra's authority could submit appeals, and the board would review them case by case. I asked about refunds. He said refunds would be addressed as part of the audit. I said that was not acceptable. I said the board needed to commit to a settlement that included refunds and limits on enforcement. Keith said he could not make that commitment without board approval. Ed said the board could approve it right now. Keith said the board needed legal counsel. Ed said the board had already consulted legal counsel and made the decision to table the vote, so clearly counsel was available. Keith sighed. He said the board would draft a settlement proposal and present it at the next meeting. I said fine. I also said I wanted Sandra to apologize on the record in front of the room. Keith said that was not appropriate. I said it was completely appropriate. I said Sandra had slandered me, called me disruptive, and tried to have my car towed based on fraudulent paperwork. I said she owed me an apology. Keith said he would relay the request. I said I was not requesting. I said I was demanding. Ed said he seconded the demand. A few other residents stood and said they wanted apologies too. Keith said the board would take it under advisement. I said that meant no. He said it meant the board would consider it. I said I would see him at the next meeting. I walked out. Sandra was standing in the parking lot near her car, on the phone. She saw me and ended the call. She said this was not over. I said I agreed. I said the state attorney general was going to investigate the referral deal and the tow company was going to lose its contract. She said I had no proof. I said I had portal logs, screenshots, and witness testimony. She said the portal was private and I had accessed it illegally. I said Ed had accessed it with his own credentials and I had used public records law. She said she would find a way to make me regret this. I said she already had. I said she had pushed me into documenting everything, and I now had enough evidence to bury her. She got in her car and drove off. The next meeting happened 3 weeks later. Keith sent an email saying the board had completed an internal audit and would present findings at the meeting. The email also said Sandra had resigned. I forwarded the email to Ed. He said Sandra had not resigned voluntarily. He said Keith had given her an ultimatum, resign or be removed for cause. Ed also said the audit had uncovered more than just the tow kickbacks. Sandra had been issuing violations to renters exclusively, ignoring identical violations by homeowners. The audit found she had collected over $8,000 in fines from renters in the past year, and less than $500 from homeowners. The disparity was obvious. Ed said the board was panicking because the findings exposed them to a discrimination lawsuit. He said I should push for a settlement that included refunds, policy limits, and a public apology from Sandra. I said Sandra would never apologize. He said she would, if the board required it as part of her resignation agreement. He said the board was desperate to avoid litigation, and they would agree to almost anything. I arrived at the clubhouse early. The parking lot was less crowded this time. A few familiar faces, including the delivery driver and the woman who had been fined for the planter. Ed was already inside. He said Keith had asked to speak with me before the meeting started. I found Keith in a side room. He looked exhausted. He said the board had reviewed my records request and prepared a settlement offer. He handed me a folder. The offer included full refunds for all fines issued under Sandra's authority, a revised enforcement policy with clear appeals procedures, and a commitment to third-party oversight for future violations. I asked about the apology. Keith said Sandra had agreed to issue a written apology as part of her resignation. I said I wanted it delivered in person. Keith said that was not part of the agreement. I said it needed to be. I said Sandra had humiliated me in public, and a written apology was not enough. Keith said he would ask her. I said he would require her. I said the board was facing a potential lawsuit, and my cooperation depended on the apology. Keith said fine. He said Sandra would apologize at the start of the meeting. I asked if the apology would be recorded. He said meetings were not recorded. I said this one would be. I said I was bringing a camera, and if Sandra refused to apologize on the record, I would walk out and file a complaint with the state. Keith nodded. He said he understood. He also said the board was freezing enforcement pending a policy rewrite. I said that was already part of the settlement. He said he wanted to emphasize it. He said the board had made mistakes, and they were committed to fixing them. I said I appreciated that. I also said the board needed to fire the tow company. Keith said the contract was under review. I said the contract needed to be terminated immediately. He said the board would vote on it tonight. I said good. The meeting started at 7. Keith called it to order and said the board had completed an audit of enforcement practices. He said the audit had identified several procedural issues and the board was committed to implementing reforms. He said the first step was addressing past violations. He said residents who had been fined under questionable circumstances would receive full refunds. He said the refunds would be processed within 30 days. A few people clapped. Keith said the board was also revising the enforcement policy to include clear definitions, transparent appeals, and third-party oversight. He said the revised policy would be presented for community vote at the next meeting. Then he paused. He said Sandra Reed had resigned as compliance officer and welcome committee chair. He said Sandra had agreed to address the community as part of her departure. Sandra walked in from the side door. She looked smaller somehow. Her white light jacket was wrinkled, and her ponytail was loose. She stood at the front of the room and pulled a folded paper from her pocket. She read from it. She said she had made errors in judgment during her tenure, and she regretted any harm caused to residents. She said she took full responsibility and apologized to those affected. The room was silent. I raised my hand. Keith called on me. I said the apology was too vague. I said Sandra had targeted renters, fabricated violations, and taken kickbacks from a tow company. I said I wanted her to acknowledge those specific actions. Keith looked at Sandra. She looked at the floor. She said she had enforced rules inconsistently, and she acknowledged that some violations were issued in error. She said she had accepted referral payments from a vendor, and she understood that was inappropriate. She said she apologized to anyone who felt unfairly treated, I said felt was not the same as was. She said she apologized to anyone who was unfairly treated. I said good. I sat down. Sandra folded the paper and walked out. The room erupted in whispers. Keith banged the gavel. He said the board would now vote on terminating the tow company contract. The vote was unanimous. He said the board would also vote on the settlement agreement. The vote was unanimous. He said the meeting was adjourned. I walked out with Ed. He said I had done it. I said we had done it. He said Sandra was finished, and the board was on notice. He said I should stay involved to make sure they followed through. I said I would. I also said I was moving out at the end of my lease. He asked why. I said I was done with HOAs. He laughed. He said that was fair. The refunds came through 4 weeks later. I got a check for $390, which covered the original fine plus all the bogus escalation fees. Ed got a check too, for violations Sandra had issued when he challenged her in the group chat. About a dozen other residents got refunds. The total payout was over $6,000. The board also published the revised enforcement policy. The new policy required photographic evidence for all violations, a mandatory 10-day appeal window, and third-party review for any fine over $100. The policy also banned referral agreements with vendors and required quarterly audits of enforcement actions. Ed said it was the most transparent policy he had seen in 8 years. He said the board had been forced into accountability, and it was a good outcome. I agreed. I also found out what happened to Sandra. She moved out of Prairie Crossing 2 months later. Ed said she had been asked to resign from 2 other HOA boards after word spread about the kickback scheme. He said her reputation was destroyed and she would never hold a leadership position again. I did not feel bad for her. She had made my life hell for 3 months and tried to have my car towed over a fake violation. She had also targeted my brother, who needed stability and could not afford the stress. The consequences were fair. I moved out at the end of my lease. My brother and I found a house in the North Valley with no HOA and no design covenants. The rent was higher, but the freedom was worth it. I still see Ed occasionally. He stayed in Prairie Crossing and joined the new board. He said the reforms held and enforcement dropped by 70%. He said residents were happier and the neighborhood felt less like a police state. He also said the board hired a professional management company to handle violations, so no single person could weaponize the rules again. I told him I was glad it worked out. He said I had forced the change and the community owed me. I said I just wanted to park in my own driveway without getting harassed. He laughed. He said that should not have been a fight, but it was, and I won. I will bring you another story soon.